expanded US sanctions by targeting President Putin's chief of staff and 19 others. Among them are some of the Russian president's closest friends and several business tycoons, including the head of Russian railways. All of them will face travel restrictions and a freeze on their assets. Also targeted is a Russian bank, Bank Rossiya, which is thought to hold assets of the ruling elite. President Obama explained his reasons for stiffening sanctions.
Russia must know that further escalation will only isolate it further from the international community. Basic principles that govern relations between nations in Europe and around the world must be upheld in the 21st century. That includes respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. The notion that nations do not simply redraw borders or make decisions at the expense of their neighbors simply because they are larger or more powerful.
President Putin's spokesman condemned the American moves as unacceptable. The Russian foreign ministry warned that what he called each hostile act will be met in an adequate manner. Shortly after Moscow retaliated, targeting members of President Obama's inner circle, including his deputy national security advisor and 2 top aides. European leaders said they too would extend their sanctions against key officials who were connected with the events in Crimea. The French President, François Hollande, indicated an EU-Russian summit would be cancelled. Chancellor Merkel, speaking in the German parliament, said that in the case of any further escalation of the crisis, the Europeans were willing to impose economic sanctions. She also said that the G8 forum of leading countries would in effect become a G7 with Russia excluded.
Ja, das ist doch offenbar. It is obvious that as long as the political context for such an important format like the G8 does not apply, as is the case at the moment, the G8 doesn't exist anymore, neither the summit nor the format as such.
But it was clear that some of the European leaders arriving for a summit in Brussels had strong reservations about moving to economic sanctions because of their reliance on Russian energy. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, spoke of the need for Europe to present a united front.
This is an important council because what Russia has done is unacceptable, and the countries of the European Union need to speak with a clear and united voice. What that means is more asset freezes and travel bans, more action specifically in respect of what's happened in the Crimea.
There were few hints of compromise today. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, told the American Secretary of State John Kerry that Moscow will not revisit its decision to incorporate Crimea into Russia.
Sanctions imposed by the United States are against some of President Putin's closest allies and oldest friends. They include his chief of staff, Sergei Ivanov, as well as some of Russia's richest people, and described by the US Treasury as Putin's personal banker. Our correspondent in Moscow, Daniel Sanford, has this assessment of who the sanctions are targeting.
If President Obama wanted the new sanctions to make headlines in Russia, he's going to succeed. The list of 16 individuals includes some of the biggest names in President Putin's inner circle. Smooth and inscrutable, Sergei Ivanov is an old KGB colleague from the 1970s and 80s, who is now President Putin's chief of staff and sometimes mentioned as a possible successor. His deputy, Alexei Gromov, is also being sanctioned. Arkady and Boris Rothenberg were childhood friends and judo buddies of the president. They have become billionaires through winning state construction contracts, including from Gazprom and the Sochi Winter Olympics. Vladimir Yakunin is the head of Russian railways, but is also an old friend from St. Petersburg who is heavily involved in the links between the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church. Then there is Yuri Kovalchuk, the man described by the US Treasury as President Putin's personal banker. His bank, Bank Rossiya, holds the money of many senior Russian officials, and its shareholders include some of President Putin's closest friends. And there's Gennady Timchenko, the head of the mysterious commodities company Gunvor, which the US Treasury says President Putin has investments in, though the company immediately denied this. Between them, the men illustrate how President Putin runs Russia, using a tight circle of old friends whose loyalty is unquestioned, and many of whom have a background in the security services. Two notable omissions are Igor Sechin and Alexei Miller, the chief executives of the big oil and gas companies Rosneft and Gazprom. And the list has no ministers on it. That said, many of the 16 who are included are more influential than any minister.
Ships and reconnaissance planes have converged on the world's most remote sea areas, following what may be the strongest clue yet to the whereabouts of the missing Malaysian airliner. Nearly a fortnight after the disappearance of flight MH370, the focus of the search has moved to the far south of the Indian Ocean. The Australian government released satellite images of two large objects floating in the water, more than 1,500 miles southwest of Perth. The operation, which was suspended as darkness fell, is due to resume in a few hours. Reporting from Perth, our correspondent, Phil Mercer.
The search that began in the tropical waters of Malaysia has now switched to the icy southern seas of the Indian Ocean. After many false leads, Australian authorities say that debris spotted southwest of Perth is the most tangible breakthrough so far in efforts to solve the mystery of flight MH370. The satellite images were taken last Sunday, so the fragments could by now have drifted far from where they were originally seen. An American journalist, David Wright, has been on board a reconnaissance plane, which is preparing for another day of searching.
What we saw when we came through the cloud cover wasn't the debris of an airplane, but was a freighter that appears to have just been passing through. That was the beginning of 3 hours of intensive searching, very low on the water, 300 feet above the waves, at full throttle, searching an area of 4,100 square miles.
Bad weather has hampered rescue aircraft from Australia, New Zealand and the United States, which have been confronted by thick cloud and rain. They'll shortly resume their mission. Britain is sending a Royal Navy coastal survey ship HMS Echo to join the search, while a Norwegian freighter is already scouring the seas for what could be vital clues in the hunt for the missing jets. Malaysia's government has insisted that the search would be continuing elsewhere, despite the sighting of debris in the Indian Ocean.
Officials in Malaysia and Australia have been at pains not to raise false hopes about what may be found. Transport correspondent Richard Westwood has been assessing the strength of the evidence that has prompted the search.
After 2 weeks of chasing shadows, this investigation now has what's being called a credible lead. Just how credible is it? The largest piece of debris photographed is 24 metres long. That size could fit with a wing or part of the body from a Boeing 777. Plenty of sea containers fall off ships and float around, but they're normally only around 12 metres long. It's in a convincing place too. If the aircraft had headed south, that's about the point where it would have run out of fuel. Having said all of that, the oceans are full of rubbish, and it could easily be a false alarm. Even if the debris is from the missing aircraft, it's unlikely to solve this mystery. Tony Cable is an air accident investigator.
It doesn't mean to say that there will be a lot of information to be gained from the floating wreckage. Well, one exception might be if there'd been in-flight fire, the fire damage on the wreckage, and the distribution might give some indications of what happened.
If this does start to be part of flight MH370, and it's still a big investigators face a huge challenge. This part of the Indian Ocean is one of the most isolated corners of the world. In parts, the
Polish car in front of us, supporting Manchester United.
Could have floated hundreds of miles from where the aircraft actually crashed and sank to the ocean bed. It would take a lot of technology and a lot of luck to find the rest of the airplane.
A day after announcing the most far-reaching reforms of the pension system in a generation, Chancellor George Osborne has insisted that people
what they'll have to do is drop a buoy where it was seen last and see where it drifts.
Those reaching retirement age will be able to spend their pension
which direction it drifts.
Rather than having to use it in annuity.
That will give them an idea of which way to look for it. Those currents don't change.
An end to, but represent an opportunity for insurance companies to up their game and new competitive product.
Like atmospheric circulation, currents don't swap round a lot.
People who have saved through their safer pension, these are responsible people who are capable of making decisions with good advice and future. For many people, they'll not be to, but for many other people, when you've not been good value, they've not produced the incomes that people. And I want people to be trusted to make decisions in their future.
Labour has warned that the reforms could lead to people squandering their money. The Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls has welcomed greater flexibility, but he said there must be proper protections and advice to prevent people making the wrong choices.
That stands to reason.
To find people in their 50s today with pension funds, finding out in years' time what the Chancellor called liberalising radical end up being written irresponsible. That's scrutinised it very carefully.
Around 3/4 of retirees buy an annuity. Our personal reporter Simon Gong considers who will lead it by preference. Rules are being relaxed in 2 steps, so that by next year, savers will be able to pay to their pension money as they see fit at the age of 55, though they will have to pay some tax. Already used the funds to buy annuities, miss out on the changes, while employees looking for pensions based on their salaries aren't affected, but the rest, including millions who are currently being automatically enrolled in work pensions, will be able to opt for annuities which are providing very low incomes. The concern is that on retiring, some will blow the money poverty relying on the state. Ministers have been looking at a pension system with some freedoms. Introduced Australia. They're the most popular choice, either cash in the whole pension allotment, with more than half reinvesting the proceeds for the future or buying an annuity. Use some of the money to pay off debts, while 9% buy a car, 14% use it to go on holiday. The tax and spending measures outlined in the budget have come under independent scrutiny, with the Institute for Fiscal Studies presenting its analysis. The IFS pension change were one of the
Don't
biggest
think we'll get through here. No, we'll change
It's a question
anyway, I think.
estimates of how much this tax revenue will be generated. Well, it's clear how other tax cuts will be funded. Here's our business correspondent, John T. Ball.
The IFS is generally in favour of the changes to pensions and savings announced by the Chancellor in his budget yesterday. Although it did say that there would be winners of this, it welcomed the general idea of providing people with more freedom to manage their own money. But the budget did not give details of the very large further cuts in spending that will be necessary to reduce the deficit in coming years. And the IFS says by announcing permanent giveaways, such as the increase in the personal tax allowance